fuck the streets, and return to the moral law. The culture war inside Black America is no longer merely about music. It is about what kind of culture we intend to leave to the next generation. One black angry Maga general. There's a cultural argument happening inside Black America that deserves far more serious attention than it receives. It isn't simply conservative versus liberal. It isn't simply Democrat versus Republican. And it isn't even simply old school versus new school. It is a battle over something more fundamental. What do we believe is worth becoming? One side of the argument says, get the money, live fast, stay dangerous, don't cooperate, don't snitch, don't apologize, get yours, and never let anybody tell you how to live. The other side is beginning to answer, enough funerals, enough prison sentences, enough children growing up without fathers, enough glorification of destruction, enough turning trauma into entertainment and then pretending we're surprised when the trauma reproduces itself in real life. And perhaps the most fascinating thing about this cultural confrontation is that one of the loudest recent challenges to street mythology came from inside hip-hop itself. Fuck the streets. In December 2025, 21 Savage publicly urged Young Thug and Gunna to reconcile and rejected the street code mentality that had become entangled with their feud. His message was blunt. Fuck the streets. We ain't get shit but trauma from that shit. Young Thug subsequently echoed the sentiment. That moment mattered. Now, because 21 Savage suddenly became a conservative, not because hip-hop suddenly became Christian, but because somebody who understood the mythology from the inside appeared to be asking whether the mythology was worth the price. And that is a question worth asking. What exactly are the streets producing? More freedom or more funerals? More fathers or more fatherless children? More wealth or more young men spending their most productive years behind bars? More community or more trauma? The contradiction. Here's the contradiction that we have to confront. The entertainment industry can take the language of the streets, package it, sell it globally, make millions of dollars from it, and then send the consequences back to the same neighborhoods from which the imagery originated. The artist gets rich, the record labels get richer, the streaming service gets paid, the audience gets entertained, and somebody's little brother gets buried. That's not an argument against hip-hop. Hip-hop is one of America's greatest cultural inventions. It has given the world poetry, rhythm, and entrepreneurship, fashion, language, dance, and an extraordinary vocabulary for describing American life. But describing a culture and glorifying its worst impulses are not the same thing. The spend that problem. This is where the cultural debate becomes particularly uncomfortable. There is a difference between saying, this is what I have seen, and saying, this is what you should become. Art can document the street without worshiping the street. A rapper can describe violence without celebrating violence. A filmmaker can portray addiction without making addiction aspirational. A novelist can depict a criminal without making criminality heroic. The moral question isn't, can artists talk about this? Of course they can. The question is, what are we teaching young people to admire? That's the question parents should be asking. That's the question educators should be asking. That's the question pastors should be asking. That's the question artists should be asking. And frankly, that's the question politicians should be afraid to answer. Demon time versus moral law. The phrase demon time is revealing because it captures something larger than a slogan. It represents an attitude that says, I'm going to do what feels good tonight and worry about the consequences tomorrow. But civilizations cannot survive indefinitely on this philosophy. A society needs boundaries. A child needs boundaries. A family needs boundaries. A neighborhood needs boundaries. A nation needs boundaries. And the deepest foundation for those boundaries is what religious traditions have historically called moral law. Catholic theology makes an important distinction here. The moral law isn't merely a list of arbitrary restrictions imposed by authorities. It is an understanding of the good toward which human beings are ordered. The Catechism describes the natural moral law as something inscribed by the Creator in the human heart. In other words, there are things that are wrong even when nobody is watching. Murder doesn't become right because somebody calls it street justice. Lying doesn't become honorable because somebody calls it the code. Destroying families doesn't become liberation because somebody calls it living your best life. And exploiting another human being doesn't become acceptable because somebody made a song about it. The moral law refuses to let us rename evil until we feel comfortable with it. The most radical word in this debate may be responsibility. We've spent decades talking about rights, and rightly so. But civilization cannot survive on rights alone. Rights require responsibility. Freedom requires discipline. Liberty requires virtue. Opportunity requires preparation. And manhood requires responsibility. That's why I believe the cultural conversation needs to recover something that has become increasingly unfashionable: personal responsibility. Not because the structural problems don't exist, they do. Not because racism doesn't exist, it does. Not because poverty doesn't matter, it does. But acknowledging structural problems cannot become an excuse for surrendering individual agency. Two things can be true simultaneously. America can have structural problems, and individuals can still be responsible for their choices. Those propositions are not enemies. They are both necessary for serious social analysis. This is where Byron Donalds enters the conversation. I don't present Byron Donalds as some magical savior of Black America. No politician deserves that title. But his emergence is culturally significant. Donalds is now the Republican nominee for governor of Florida, and his November race against Democrat Dave Jolly gives him a chance to become Florida's first black governor. That matters regardless of one's politics. Why? Because executive leadership changes the conversation. For generations, black political discussion has often been framed around representation within institutions controlled by other people. The question becomes, who is sitting at the table? But perhaps the next question should be, who is capable of building the table? That requires something beyond racial representation. It requires leadership, competence, moral courage, economic vision, educational seriousness, public safety, and the ability to tell your own constituency something it doesn't necessarily want to hear. Barack Obama and the question of political possibility. There is an interesting parallel here. Before Barack Obama became president, many Americans could imagine a black president intellectually, but Obama's political ascent transformed that possibility into something tangible. Byron Donalds now occupies a different but historically significant position. If he wins Florida's governorship, he would become the state's first black governor. AP reports that only 3 black Americans have ever been elected governor in U.S. history, making the 2026 gubernatorial cycle unusually significant for black representation in executive office. That doesn't mean Donald's is Obama. It doesn't mean his policies are Obama's. It doesn't mean their coalitions are the same. But it does mean that black political possibility is expanding beyond the old ideological boundaries. And that is worth noticing. The J.D. Vance question. Could Byron Donalds someday become a vice presidential candidate? Certainly. Could he appear on a future ticket with J.D. Vance? That is possible. But as of now, that is speculation. And I don't want to build an argument on political fan fiction. What interests me more is the possibility represented by the conversation itself. Imagine a political generation in which black political leadership is no longer automatically assumed to belong to one ideological camp. Imagine black politicians competing across ideological lines. Imagine conservatives competing for black votes. Imagine progressives competing for conservative black votes. Imagine Republicans having to explain their policies to black communities. Imagine Democrats having to explain theirs. Imagine neither party being able to say you have nowhere else to go. Now that's democracy. The real revolution is cultural. But here's where I believe we have made a mistake. We have treated political transformation as though it can occur without cultural transformation. It can't. A politician cannot legislate character. A governor cannot manufacture fathers. A president cannot force children to respect their parents. A government program cannot substitute permanently for a functioning community, and no political party can rescue a culture that has stopped believing in responsibility. Politics matters, but culture often comes first. We need a new black cultural aspiration. I want young people to see something different. I want the young black boy who sees a successful man to see more than jewelry. Show him the doctor, show him the engineer, show him the entrepreneur, show him the teacher, show him the soldier, show him the priest, show him the mechanic who owns his shop, show him the father who comes home every night, show him the man who never spent the night in prison. Show him the man who built something his children can inherit. And yes, show him the rapper who became wealthy without needing to pretend that destruction is the definition of black authenticity. Because perhaps the greater cultural lie we have accepted was this, that dysfunction is somehow more authentically black than excellence. It isn't. Malcolm X understood something about discipline. Malcolm X's transformation is instructive precisely because he didn't remain trapped in the identity he inherited. His life was an extended argument with himself. He changed, he studied, he disciplined himself, he expanded his worldview, and eventually his understanding of humanity became considerably broader than the ideology with which he had begun. That's important because a culture that cannot change is a culture that cannot grow. And a person who refuses to examine his assumptions eventually becomes imprisoned by them. Martin Luther King Jr. understood the moral dimension. King understood that the civil rights movement wasn't merely asking America to change laws. It was asking America to confront right and wrong. That distinction matters. If racism is wrong because human beings possess dignity, then violence against one's neighbor is also wrong. If discrimination is wrong because human beings possess dignity, then exploitation is wrong for the same reason. If segregation is wrong because human beings are created in God's image, then destroying another human being for street reputation is also wrong. The moral law cannot be selectively applied. We cannot demand dignity for America while denying dignity to one another. The most important line in the 21 Savage debate the most important part of the fuck the streets discussion isn't the profanity, it's the word trauma. We ain't get shit but trauma. That's a confession. Because underneath the bravado, the cars, the money, the jewelry, the videos, the weapons, and the mythology is something much less glamorous: pain. And maybe that's where the cultural conversation needs to begin. Not with condemnation, not with shame, not with lectures, with honesty. What did the streets actually give us? If the answer is trauma, perhaps it's time to build something better. The new cultural equation. I would propose a different formula. Faith, family, education, work, discipline, entrepreneurship, community, responsibility, freedom. Not perfection, not utopia, freedom. Because real freedom isn't the ability to destroy yourself without consequences. Real freedom is having the power to become the person you were created to become. That's the moral law. That's human dignity. And that's the cultural revolution I believe worth having. So yes, fuck the streets, but let's finish the sentence. Fuck the streets that bury our children. Fuck the streets that turn brothers against brothers. Fuck the streets that teach young men that prison is a badge of honor. Fuck the streets that confuse recklessness with courage. Fuck the streets that sell trauma back to us as entertainment. But don't fuck the people. Save the people. Build the people. Educate the people. Love the people. Challenge the people. And give them something better to believe in. Because the answer to destructive culture isn't merely saying stop. The answer is giving people a reason to say, I want something better. And perhaps that is the real challenge facing Black America and America itself. Not simply which politician wins the next election, but which values win the next generation. One angry Black Maga general signing off. Peace.